welcome to everybody who is joining us today. I'm looking at people's here, and I was saying earlier, it's a great name. So lovely to see Scylla. Hello, Wilma. Yeah, hi, and Neil and Greg and Keith. So it's great to see people from both different parts of the UK, but also we've got Barry joining us from Narbonne, and hello, Marjorie. As well. Hi. So very warm welcome. We're just going to, or I'm just wanted to provide a very brief piece of context and then introduce Sharon, who's going to be doing our first presentation today. For some of you, and I know there are a handful of people who've not been to previous events, a little bit of kind of context. It's great that we've got John Holford, Sharon and Scylla here as original members of the Centenary Commission. So the starting point for the work that we're talking about today was the Centenary Commission and its report in 2019, followed by the first event, an event where Sharon spoke to talk about one of the. So in 2020, one of the themes of the Centenary Commission report related to what the whole research circle has been concerned with around building community democracy and dialogue. So since spring of 2021, a group of us have organised 3 online events each year. So you're very welcome to today's event. So the context is we've been meeting since 2021, and one of the links on the Centenary Commission website gives you context and background on each of those presentations. What's been really interesting to reflect on is the ways in which we've developed that work, and that work is developed with Sharon and I working with the support and with contributions from Scylla, from Lyndon West, from John Holford, and from Tom Woodin as part of a kind of a core group. And what we've, I suppose, done is, thinking most recently, we've combined presentations that have been about adult education in particular places, very much grounded in particular places, but that work in turn has related to kind of underpinning themes. So, for example, our event in December last year, Sharon, where what we were looking at was different manifestations of the arts and adult education. But the example was the Big Pits Museum in the Welsh Valleys and the Portland Inn project in North Staffordshire. But when I was kind of thinking about that, one of the things I thought that was really interesting is that both of those pieces of work were outside of what we might call mainstream, however we conceive of that, mainstream adult education. So what we got were incredibly powerful pieces of work, but outside of that, the mainstream. So, for example, I think it's today is the closing date of the all-party parliamentary group on adult education. They've put a call out for evidence, but their framing of adult education was to do with skills and work. And that presentation, the 2 presentations that I've just referred to from South Wales and Portland Inn, implicitly related to that, but didn't relate to that kind of narrow conceiving of adult education and work. So that's kind of, for me, one of the kind of interesting recurring themes. But as well as talking about the origins and those themes, perhaps a question that we've looked at before and is a recurring and perhaps question for today is all around, and Sharon and I were talking about this earlier, about memory and nostalgia. So how do we see how do these interrelate? How do they differ? And if we're looking at our work, if we're looking at our interests, both personally and collectively, it may be that throughout today, after each of the presentations and in the discussion at the end, we might want to ask how our own memories and the archives that we're going to be hearing about today, how do those memories and those archives shape, in Raymond Williams's phrase, resources of hope? So that what we've got are possibly resources that may help us in those acts of reimagining and reworking adult education, because that reimagining and that reworking, it seems to me, is way beyond what that all parliamentary group was asking for comments on this week. So those are just some of my thoughts. Hopefully that's been useful in terms of context, in terms of some of the themes, but also the questions. So this whole issue around memory and nostalgia leads me into introducing Sharon, who's going to do the first presentation, and then we're going to be joined by presentations from Linda and Dani. The suggestion is that each of the presentations will be approximately half an hour with space for questions. We'll take a pause, perhaps after Sharon, if Sharon agrees, we can pause and perhaps take a short break. Then we will return for Dani and Linda with space for overall questions at the end, if that sounds okay. So that's the part of what we're about, part of about today's kind of purpose. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Sharon, who's a kind of, in many ways, along with Scilla and John, initiated all of this work. And we're going to hear now today about Sharon's current Leverhulme research project on the title that we've got here on the screen. So I'm delighted to introduce Sharon to talk about her current work. Over to you, Sharon.
Thank you very much, Ian. Can I just check if everyone can see that okay?
Indeed,
I would use slideshow, but I'm slightly nervous about using it today because my computer's playing up slightly. So I'm going to try and do it this way. But if it gets difficult to read, I'll see if I can use the slideshow function. And I think I've got a bit of an echo. Is that all right? Can everybody hear me? Yeah, fantastic. So I was delighted to, it has to be said, and quite slightly staggered to be successful in applying for Leverhulme funding last year for a research fellowship looking at specifically the vanishing world of experimental adult education, and I deliberately entitled it with a kind of degree of passion and pain at the same time, Lost Spaces and Untold Stories, because I feel that this is a world that is rapidly becoming, and this goes straight to Ian's point, a point of memory. I don't see it as a point of nostalgia. I see it as a resource for hope in the sense of shaping the future, but also an act of resilience and resistance to an increasingly marketized education world. But it was with great joy that I got the opportunity to have a year focused on exploring these stories and these spaces. And that's what I've started to do. And I've got a few images dotted through. This one is one of my personal favorites. This is when me and Scilla was my guide, and the great joy for me was going with Scilla to Coleg Harlech in January, who had been a student there herself in the late 70s. So I hope Scilla doesn't mind. I've used her image outside the gates of Coleg Harlech before we managed to get access to the building on the first day when we arrived, and we looked around. An incredibly important space, an incredibly emotional experience for Scilla, but also for me, I have to say. So I'll talk more about it. And this, by the way, is an image of Coleg Harlech from much earlier in its history, showing a rather beautiful palatial building. And this is, I believe, before the student blocks were built, which is something that we'll perhaps talk about. So I want to come on just to give you a little bit of an overview about the research itself, but I will say that this is very much a starter for 10. because I've only just finished my final interview. In fact, I have one more to do this coming week. So I haven't actually started the detailed process of analysis, which I'm sure will be utterly immersive. And I envisage spending at least a month doing that, where I listen back to all the audio recordings and look at the testimony and photographs I've managed to collect so far over the last 5 months, and start to try to make sense of this incredible body of work that's come together through your support. Many of the people here on this at this event have contributed as interviewers or have provided me with contacts, and I'm immensely grateful to everybody here. So it's a 1 year funded research project. It started in October, as I've said, runs through to the end of October this year. And it has a number of key outputs that obviously one that is really central for me is this idea of a virtual archive. Now, this is something that we've been talking about, myself and John and Scylla and others, for at least the last 6, 7 years, longer. In fact, I remember a conversation that John, Scylla and I had in my office at work. Oh, it's got to be possibly getting on for 10 years ago, where we started to talk about the need for archiving the materials associated with adult education before many of the resources are gone or dispersed, and to try and capture some of those memories while they're still fresh, and while we can still utilize them as positively as possible. So it's very much a historical piece of research in one sense, but in another, I see it as profoundly about the contemporary space, a world in which we see such changes to education and such damage and erosion to the principles of democratic education, that it feels incredibly important to try and capture this. So I've done this through something like 40 interviews so far. There may be more, but they're very much at the end of that period, if you like. And I've taken an oral history perspective in that I'm very much interested in listening to people's stories and reflections and experiences, and their and how they relate that to their own lived experience, the ongoing and enduring relationships that's kind of formed with education. So we've got a few events that we're intending to kind of develop. And obviously this is one of them, but this is very much a starting point. And then we're also looking at broader dissemination through articles, materials that come together through the research, and ultimately some form of book proposal and outline by the end of research period. It's interesting because when I started, because I know far more about the residential education movement, having looked at Attingham College in Shropshire for my PhD study in 2014 to 2017, and that took me into the realms of talking to Derek Tatton at Wedgwood Memorial College at the time, Walter Drews from Nuston Hall, many people who contributed at that point to my research, who I also have recorded. Um, the emphasis has kind of shifted. So I've found more and more that I've become interested in the wider community-based movements, the wider network movements like the cooperative movement, and the wider movements around the WEA in particular. And I've interviewed many people from a WEA background. That's been incredibly interesting and quite painful, I have to say, in terms of the shifts and changes that I've seen there. So the process of analysis is starting to take place. And I've looked at far more than 20 spaces, but you could say 20 physical spaces, and far more where we're talking about intellectual movements. So just to give you a kind of glimpse of that, the key organisations and spaces where I've undertaken interviews so far include all those listed here. So a broad range of residential colleges connected to the cooperative movement, to short-term residential adult education, such as Attingham, to religious-based and or Quaker-related education, such as at Woodbrook, and a whole range of broader educational establishments like Hillcroft, Northern Ruskin, and Fircroft that have had a longer term adult education focus, but also a huge number of non-residential contacts and interviews throughout the WEA across the country, which has encompassed areas around the women's movement and the development of women's education, specifically the departments of continuing education, extramural bodies, again across the UK, trade union studies, which has come up often in the WEA meetings and conversations that I've been having, and the broader second chance spaces that we all know in the community and their demise increasingly. Also, the Educational Centres Association and the Socialist Education Association. So, again, I'll be able to say far more about that over a period of time. But first and foremost, I just wanted to start with an image which I think kind of encapsulates some of this notion of lost spaces and some of the critical importance of capturing literally this infrastructure before it's gone. This is Bretton Hall in West Yorkshire. You can see the image in the photograph on the right, which is a derelict building, which you have to kind of break through the barriers, as it were, or push through the barriers to physically get onto the site now and take photographs at all. Juxtaposed with some images from the late 1980s, kindly provided to me by Wendy Goddard, who was one of my earlier interviewees, showing some student-based activities and young children here dressing up, who subsequently went down into, as I understand it, the cellars and the drains to reenact a post-apocalyptic world as part of their drama experience, and also a sunny image of Bretton Hall in its heyday. And we're not talking years and years and years ago, but we are talking this huge and sudden shift. And I think the photo on the right encapsulates that kind of shift as the space becomes overgrown and derelict, and the joy and exuberance of the images on the left. So just to start us off. And I guess my key interview questions with everybody have been very much about student experience, what it felt like to be a student in these spaces, be it the WEA, be it one of the residential colleges, whatever that particular space might have been. And I've asked directly about the impact on the individual's life, but not just their life, their observations of the impact on people's lives that they've had connection with other students, the staff they've engaged with. And I've talked to many staff brilliantly, particularly at Coleg Harlech, about their subject, their role, what motivated them as educators, what their pedagogical subjects and focus were, and what the room for experimentation was. And the interview testimony has just been utterly brilliant, and I'll say more about that. But it's very much about the freedom to innovate, and also the incredible scholarly diligence that I've identified through every person I've spoken to, the passion and deep kind of connection with quality education. And shifts and changes in governance and ownership, as people have been part of that experience for 20, 30 years sometimes, teaching at Coleg Harlech, for example. Have they observed changes and shifts in governance and ownership? And how has that impacted on both the teaching experience and the student experience, but also how that mirrors some of the wider changes in society that we are all aware of? What those timelines were, could they see a change at specific points? And that's been something I've asked every interviewee. There's also going to be, hopefully, as part of the virtual archive that I've referred to, not just the photographs I've been taking, others that people have shared with me, but also some film material, which I'm still trying to develop, and images that have been important to the interviewees, and materials that have been important to the interviewees. For example, I remember when I first spoke with Tom Woodin very early on, when I started the research, saying, ask people what books they were reading, what inspired them, what was important to them. And I've tried to bear that in mind throughout the research because this is about people's own intellectual life. And also an image and a phrase that stuck with me right from my very first meeting with Scylla back in October when we first started to think about some of the research and the shaping of the research before I really had any testimony under my belt. And that was very much about this idea of ghostly voices and the idea of social haunting. So the sense that these spaces are imbued with the spirit of so many past voices and activities and events. And there's something about how that is imbued in the infrastructure itself. This might sound slightly fanciful or a bit fey, but I think there's something really powerful about that. Because the infrastructure is still there at the moment in many instances, but it is deteriorating. So it's something about re-energizing, reinvigorating those spaces, at least with memory, re-imbuing them. So what struck me in my role of willful remembering, and I remember Kerry Thompson describing himself as the people's rememberer, which I thought was a great phrase last year when we talked at one of the research circle events that Ian's mentioned. But I've willfully used Ian's phrase willful remembering, which I thought was fantastic because it's that sense of deliberation. It's that sense of also a kind of deliberate act of resistance by willfully remembering, refusing to be erased and forgotten, and the sheer ambition and reach of this incredible adult education spread. So I was really struck, for instance, when I spoke with some of the colleagues who are here, in fact, from the Co-operative College, who talked about the huge ambition and reach. And I know Linda and Dani are going to explore this more later. For example, I didn't know, and that should be 1951, that's a typo, but over 50% of all corner shops in 1951 were co-ops, apparently, which I had no idea. And that the foundational principles of the cooperative movement was an emphasis on education right from the start. So this importance throughout of kind of principles driving the education, but the education absolutely sits alongside the importance of education, education and political action are kind of bedfellows. And Liz McIver summarised this really brilliantly as the desire to change society, which is fundamental to this movement as I see it and from what I'm beginning to pick up at this stage. And so for me, this has been about moving against a process of erasure. Several people have used that word quite deliberately and trying to move into a position of recovering some of the materials and memories with a view to making this this powerful shift to something we can utilize. So I think this is as much about forms of association, how we come together, how we collectively mobilize, as it is about the curriculum and the pedagogy itself. And therefore, it is about the deep politicization of education. Ever since I started my thesis, when I read a quote from Walter Drews, who I enormously respected in terms of his own intellectual history of the adult residential college movement, but he described it as being politically left field, something that perhaps wasn't central to political interest. And I think the whole movement, as I've seen it, has been very much about an overt politicization, that adult education is centrally a political force. And it's not about socially organized arrangements that acquire meaning. Or not, it's not about models that we can just move from one space to another, but it is about socially organized arrangements that acquire meaning through the people, through the alliances, the conflicts, and the kind of institutional ecologies that sustain and develop them. And that centrality of the power of tutorial learning, the importance of dialogue, the importance too of kindness and respect. Many students I've spoken to talked about the difficulties and the toughness of the educational regime that they experienced, but also a sense of underlying kindness and respect. And also this critical borderline between politics and education. I remember a phrase that Peter Evans used describing Coleg Harlech as Reds by the Sea, which I thought was really brilliant. So we're getting this sense throughout of a landscape, a troubling adult education, which I think is quite a brilliant phrase. It's not an easy space, it's a complex space. So it's one that I think we need to celebrate more. Something that was really brought out for me, in particular in the interviews at the Co-operative College, but also in conversations I've had with many people here, was about this bringing together of the vocational with the intellectual. No sense that there's a schism between the two, that this is very much about the whole human being. And it is the labour of the hand and brain brought together. And I think this is absolutely central in all the education that I've been able to look into thus far. The kind of sense of a deep lyricism about the kinds of education that were on offer. This romantic connection with land and space and place and people, but also a deep intellectual rigor, a passion for literature, a passion for the arts, a passion for the humanities, a passion for politics and social sciences, all respected, all understood in an interdisciplinary lens. And a deep intellectual freedom through every single person I've spoken to, the time and the agency to actually spend in academic and intellectual work, the access to libraries, the power of knowledge, the knowledge base that people have had access to, underpinning all this education, a deep focus on creativity, a deep space for innovation, for new subjects coming together, for new ideas formulating. And I think this is because this kind of education, as I see it, has, as Liz McIver very eloquently described it, a society first approach. So what I've heard from everyone has been about the quality of the teaching and the scholarship, this formidable value of this of the material and the people themselves presenting that material and that knowledge. And also a sense which I think was particularly brought home to me from speaking to Ben Dandelion at Woodbrook about how the importance of enlightenment coming from within, the kind of self-movement, the movement of individuals working collectively in terms of their education, and that Quaker ideal, which underpinned much of the ideas around education that I've experienced so far. At the same time, we know that we're often talking about not the most salubrious of spaces to live in. No TV sometimes, a broken record player. I remember this from my interview with Kevin, and this often taking place in cramped Spartan living conditions. This was very much a kind of yeah, make do and mend type experience. Quite often there were often a focus on the buildings, and the infrastructure may have been lacking, but at the same time there was this sense of kind of deep and fluid space where change could really take place. But there have been criticisms, perhaps, for example, about the lack of study support, people thrown into these huge periods of change in their own lives, coming from very varied backgrounds and having to deal with study at a very high level, often without the kind of study support that is so much more commonplace today. But that kind of lasting intellectual and emotional impact. And because of the forced nature of some of this space, it's acted as a place to accelerate intellectual development and spawn new movements and new ideas. But I am seeing throughout, obviously, this shift, this change that starts to take place. We see it from 1992, we see it before 1992 with the Further Education, the Local Authorities Act. We see it before that in the beginning of the demise of institutional memory and the dismantling of this incredibly powerful structure and infrastructure and series of and networks of adult education which were available to us. And a quote that really struck me at the time when I spoke to Wilma Fraser about an auditing process that was taking place at Hillcroft College. She described it as a demolition job on the part of the inspectors because they could no longer see the value of this residential space. It was more costly. It was much more demanding of people's time, and it was starting to look increasingly like something from the past. But with the loss of these spaces, we're seeing also the loss of the commons, this notion of the participatory democracy, democratic education. And also something from earlier research that John Holford and I undertook with the four then remaining adult residential colleges, which were at that point Fircroft, Hillcroft, Ruskin College and Northern College. And this sense that people were deeply proud to be part of spaces and also enjoyed the resistance and the kick from being in spaces that were formerly the spaces of the aristocracy. And their experience of being part, for example, of Northern College and describing it as the poor man's Eton. But how that wasn't about selfishness, wasn't about individualism. It was about learning collectively and collaboratively and taking back that spirit into their own community. So my whole point about these notions of social mobility that are bandied around so freely, this is very much about people wanting to go back to their own communities, newly knowledgeable, to share and spread that information. That selflessness, that motivation for society was central for so many people and so many of these spaces. But we see, of course, this increased professionalisation, the rise of management as a particular perspective, new public management, monetisation, the notion of ourselves as education, customers and consumers, the cultures of risk that took away so much of some of the playful aspects of adult education. Wendy and James Whiting both talking about Bretton Hall, talking about the play that I described earlier on, going into the cellars. These things wouldn't happen now because we're in a much more risk conscious culture. And no one is saying that that is all bad by the way, but the health and safety, the sort of technocracy has taken over. And I think there's a point that Dave Wiltshire made about this notion of a migration towards the average. So some of this activity was exceptional. It spawned in exceptional people, exceptional intellects, people taking risks with their thinking, people with great intellectual power, but more and more and more moving towards perhaps something much more average, and how costs became an increasingly important, and in fact cutting out some of those kind of intellectual innovations, the comparisons with FE growing over time. But for me, this is not, as I said earlier on, about nostalgia. It is about looking back to shape the future, as I've said many times before. But we do see there is something about attempting to capture some of these periods of time and to give them space to breathe again. So, but it is not about freezing them in time. So I think I've said quite a lot about the shifts and changes, and I don't want to go on too long. So we've seen this huge rise in massification of education. We've seen the rise and decline of the welfare state, but also that relationship with adult education is complex because some of the self-organized adult education that we've seen perhaps fared less well with the evolution of the welfare state. We're not in either of those positions at the moment, so perhaps it's harder to see that, but that is an area of tension that I'm really interested in looking at much further. So we've seen the rise of assessment of qualifications, the rise of formalised education. We've also seen the links between liberal adult education and civil society declining, And whether or not this is a cause or effect is a point of interest that I want to follow up. And interestingly, speaking to Sarah Spate, who led the Department for Continuing Education at the University of Nottingham, she talked about the importance of the subject predominating over the experience of learning, how social change is mirrored through the lens of the subject and the kinds of subject that people became more and more interested in, perhaps much less about social and political subjects and more, for example, about local history. So the way that the lens of the subject kind of reflects on societal shifts. And obviously, primarily, we see this huge economic growth and the way that that kind of, with the lens, should I say, has subsumed any kind of sense of Raymond Williams' democratic educator space. So we are seeing numbers of spaces closing or closed and shifting purpose. Some become, for example, like Woodbrook, they now provide online courses and they're using the spaces, the college itself is more of an office space. We're seeing very recent changes at Schumacher College, which are doing much more online. We see some spaces like Wedgwood Memorial College in Barlaston, which was where Derek Tatton was principal and warden, literally falling apart, falling down. And this has accelerated within the last 10 or 15 years, as have the wider political shifts that we've perhaps talked about in the WEA. I'm going to leave it there because there's a risk of going on at great length. But I just wanted to say again, thanks to everybody, and I'm hoping to have a much more coherent overview by the time I've had chance to do the kind of deep dive analysis. But for now, I'll stop sharing. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Sharon. I mean, I was just both listening and just making a few notes as you were talking, and looking at the clock here. Perhaps if people agree, we could sort of develop and extend one or 2 points and listen to people's responses, say up until 11, and we'll then take sort of a 5-minute pause. There was so much in there that I wanted to ask about, but I wanted to perhaps just pick up on one of the themes, and Scylla added a comment in the chat thread. Could you expand on your emerging thinking around this idea around haunting? Because that I thought was something that struck me as being really interesting.
This is not throwing throwing it out to Scylla, but I wondered if Scylla might, because Scylla was the person who instigated my thinking around that, and I know she knows a lot more about it than I do. I wondered, Scylla, if you might be able to say a few words about that, if you wouldn't mind. I think I've referenced it in relation to the buildings themselves in particular, but there's also notions of when I used to go to Attingham when I was first researching Attingham Park and the Shropshire Adult Education College, I became increasingly fascinated by the soundscape, the space itself, and trying to imagine what the sounds would have been like in 1948 when the college first opened. And it's that kind of location, but the sense of the people who've been there and how they've influenced and marked a place, as I understand it. But I would be interested in what Scylla would like to say on that, if you're willing.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Scylla, and then I can see Susan as well. So if we start with Scylla, and then I'll ask Susan to contribute. Scylla, are you?
Yes, thank you. Just thanks so much for that, Sharon. It's the most thrilling, upsetting, magnificent, all the things you might, poignant, powerful things. So thank you so much for doing the work, and it's just so important that the work is done. There is a writer called Avery Gordon who's based in California, University of California, I think, who wrote a book called Ghostly Matters. It's not about ghosts, but it's about the violence is done unto communities and the people within those communities through all sorts of things, whether that be deindustrialization, changing shifts, and so on, and what the impact of that is upon people, but also that the way that the collective is often torn asunder as those changes take place. I'll put a link to the book if you like. I put that link in there, Sharon, because Sharon and I had a very good chat at one time. I was involved in a project actually through the Co-operative College and with Manchester Metropolitan University, a brilliant researcher called Jeff from Barnsley, who's an ex-miner, who got Avery over to talk to various people, particularly focused on the mining sector and what had happened in communities like Barnsley, in the Dearne Valley, in various places, and Rochdale, of course. So we held, and I think Gillian is on the call, we held what they call a ghost lab. And the idea was to get people to take something out of their pocket, of something that had some meaning to them, and to talk about it, and to relate that then to their own lived experience within their communities. It's a very powerful way of storytelling. But as you alluded to, Sharon, it also helps us to understand the sort of the way that our communities carry with them all of these injustices. Avery was in particular focused on Indigenous communities in the US and what they'd experienced, the sort of violence. There's no other word to use but that. So it's been really compelling seeing the way that Sharon's using it, that notion, to look at both buildings and places and people. So I'll put the link in, Ian, in the chat.
No, cheers. Thanks, Sarah. Susan, welcome.
Sorry, I've got to do all the stuff. That was great, Sharon. As you know, I'm still looking at Wensum Lodge, which was in the middle of Norwich, which actually at one stage was a residential. Well, it was open and it wasn't just residential. But there's a whole history there. That means I'm sort of diving into the archives. I'm in the Norfolk Record Office, I'm in the Norwich Heritage Centre, and I'm also at the UEA. And it's just, I really feel it's chance that there are materials there that I can look at. And actually, they are deposits from particular individuals. And in some ways, there's just too much. Like, the person who used to coordinate the Cambridge Board of Extramural Education was also a local historian, wrote books about researching village life. There are 99 boxes, which include his gardening and seed catalogues because they haven't been properly catalogued. So I'm sort of overwhelmed, but I'm also aware of it's just luck. So yes, there are people who you can go and talk to, but I'm finding that they are dying because, if I'm trying to get people who were involved with this in the 60s and 70s, they are very elderly now. And if I don't get to them quite quickly, they've gone. So that, I suppose that's the first point is like in terms of the archive, it is quite distorted because of what somebody has decided to keep and put in an archive and what you can find. Because that doesn't mean to say, an absence doesn't mean that it didn't exist. It's just that it wasn't recorded. But I've been to, just to say, I've been to other groups and discussions around the importance of archiving. So I would say to everybody, just archive everything.
Yeah, I think
because online stuff is not going to get archived. But I was wondering about the adult education institutes that are independent that have survived. And I'm thinking particularly Morley College in London, which Wensum Lodge actually sort of based its friends group upon. I have friends who live in the same street as Morley College, and I am just, when I go down there, I'm just astounded by the range of courses. My two adult children live in London. They are both, one of them is a musician and the other one is quite really interested in music. Neither of them look at Morley College for courses and to participate or to do anything in. So I was really struck by your comment about the links between liberal adult education and civil society, because it seems to me that we don't really understand education, what education is. We probably need a redefinition of education. Um, but I was just interested in the ones that are still left and how they are left, um, how they are still standing. I know they're having to adapt, I know they're having to change, but they are still there and they are still providing opportunities in some parts of the country.
Yeah,
But that's the issue, that it's not universal. So
no.
it's great if you live in South London, but not great if you live somewhere else.
No, that's right. And I guess that's one of the things that most struck me when I started my research back in 2014, looking at Attingham, was just the sheer volume of these places across the country. And sadly, I have to say that very recently, the Northern College is actually going to be merging with Barnsley FE College, and Hillcroft was merged with Richmond College of FE back in 2017. And the only one that is, and Ruskin, as people will know, merged with the University of West London, though that I did meet with Graham Atherton, fascinating piece of research talking to him. And they are trying to keep many of the kind of Ruskin-based trade union and labour movement work activities alive. So it has taken a different form. But I was far more optimistic when I got to the end of the interview with Graham than I went into it being, if that makes sense. So people are shifting and taking new forms. Schumacher College, which is a very much an environmental and arts-based organisation, are also developing new types of provision. So there are some glimmers of optimism, but the only formal college that remains as a truly independent adult residential college is Fircroft in Birmingham, and that is testimony, I think, to the particular leadership, I have to say, of Mel Lenihan, the principal, but also talking to Mel as I have as well. It's the fact that she's visionary enough to recognise the need to collaborate, for example, with international bodies, the Danish folk high school movement overseas. Um, but she's also canny enough to kind of connect to critical social issues in Birmingham and the whole Midlands region relating to unemployment and joblessness and particularly underemployment, and is working with local authorities to kind of develop that at the same time as maintaining a passionate engagement with sustainability and environmental change. So there's a kind of a looking to the future as well as respecting the kind of regional needs and trying to bring those together. But it's a bloody hard job, there's no doubt about it. And it takes enormous energy and passion. And Mel and I have talked about this. I was a voluntary sector leader for 10 years in the Council for Voluntary Service movement. And it's exhausting. It's one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life. 'Cause it's like having a kind of massive baby that you have to tend, you know, virtually every day, 24/7. And I think there's something all encompassing about the kind of work that it requires, the emotional labour, which I know I've talked about before, but I think it's absolutely important. And I think there's something really important about democratic leadership and principles, and how so much of what I'm seeing is the distortion of governance that's actually damaged and destroyed many of these institutions. People who've come in, and numerous people have said this, without any kind of essential engagement with education and no essential personal passion for the kind of education that we're talking about, and have come in as kind of leaders, managers, and that kind of rise of managerialism. So long-winded answer, but I think it is power, it's passion, it's individual commitment, as well as being canny about the past and the contemporary environment that we're working within. And I think it's a great tragedy that there is only, in fact, Furcroft left.
We've got 10 minutes perhaps before we take a pause. And one thing that I wanted to just perhaps we can have a pick up with Linda was one of the other points you made, Sharon, was the bringing together of the vocational with the intellectual. And I know that looking at Linda's slides earlier in the week, that's something that Linda's going to touch on. So that's just posting something we could perhaps look at later. I wonder though, space for anyone else who wants to, because I think Susan's point was fascinating about perception, taking that example through the stories of family, people's perception of institutions and members of your family who are themselves, they're engaged in learning. This for me links to Josie Quinn, who's joined us, where this idea of the interrelationship between visible and invisible education. So that you may have, we ourselves, members of our family, may be learning in a whole range of ways, but whether it be music, whether it be art, whether it be through cycling, learning about basic mechanics, it isn't institutional, and it may be through caring responsibilities, etc.
Could I just kind of make an brief? And I will be talking about that aspect of vocational and liberal education in my talk. But I wanted just to bring in perhaps a very small but positive example of adult education, which is in Bolton, where I live, where liberal adult education, via the local authority and the WEA has virtually disappeared. But we have a very successful adult learning organisation called Enjoy Learning, which runs 30 to 40 adult education classes a year, is run democratically by a group, and is incredibly successful. Now, the demographic is older people, it has to be said, but if it's the only place in the Northwest you can go and learn German as an adult, or French, or Italian, or do art or history or whatever. And we're very proud of it. It's a one-off, but it has worked, and it's been running for about 10 years now. So
could you add the link in, Linda, into the?
Yeah, I'll do that.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's really interesting.
Could I come in, please? Sure. Respond to this. I think this is one of the fascinating developments in the whole morning. It's been a very good presentation, Sharon. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you, Barry.
Absolutely great. One point I would like to make is you referred to, we were references to nostalgia and hope. And I think Walter Benjamin once said, nostalgia is a very dangerous emotion. And I think this is one of the things we have to take account of. Hope is a very positive one, as Riemann Williams always would tell us. But I think Malcolm Chase, one of our old colleagues from many years ago, was also very, very critical of this idea of nostalgia. And I think we have to be very aware that what is now coming out from A now is a balance from what we had and what we have. The most recent two presentations just recently now from Linda, for example, saying in that area there is an organization there which is running a number of courses, getting people in. I think this is one of my colleagues in the Netherlands has just written that he used to work in the folk high school. There's no folk high school more, but he has now written a very good paper on where are people getting together these days. And that relates partly, I think, to Sharon's point about meeting places. The folk high school as a meeting place, the residential college as a meeting place. What is the governance and what is the ownership of these locations, these new locations? Are they self-funded? Are people putting money together? Are they subsidized? Are they working on market principles? Who's coming? Who's staying away? These, I think, are the interesting questions relationship to new developments. And as I think when I talked to you, Sharon, in the interview, I gave one example of the origin of the Dutch folk high schools in the 1920s, which were for farmers. And they were not so much residential colleges, but meeting places. This is why this word is so essential. They came together in the evenings when it was a moonlit night in the winter because they could find their way to where the meeting was. And I think this is something of the spirit of when and why people come together to learn. How I want to know much more about how this is going on today in relationship to what we had. Woodbrook, I've done a lot of work on Woodbrook in the Netherlands myself. It's still active here.
Mm.
These are very important things, the balance between the old and the new, and what these can contribute to each other and can strengthen each other. I think this is very important.
No,
Thank
that's
you.
fascinating. I've looked
Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. And Lynn has posted a comment where she's inviting Keith to talk about the Northeast and never stop learning. So if you want to take up that opportunity, Keith, would you like to just say something and perhaps take us up to a break?
Well, yes. I mean, Never Stop Learning really arose from former employees of the WEA and volunteers with the WEA when the regional committee structure was scrapped by the centralisation. And a group of us who enjoyed each other's company and didn't want that to disappear, and also valued the history of the WEA and what had been achieved in the Northeast, we decided to get together and carry on meeting. And we managed to produce two booklets, one on women's education, which was very powerful, in Washington Newtown, and the second one, which has just come out, which is on union learning works and the history of things like Return to Learn. And we managed to gather together small amounts of money and to have a conference on Friday, which had the wonderful Sharon Clancy as one of the keynote speakers, and she was brilliant. And we also had Gavin McCann, who's writing a book on the history of union learning and the retreat of unions from providing learning. I mean, it's been quite dramatic there as well. Unions really need to rediscover the whole idea of learning, not just of activists, but of their members. And it was very powerful when that happened under the previous Labour government, but the current government doesn't have any concept of that. And a lot of the local mayors aren't interested in funding union learning type stuff, which I think is again a big loss. But it does just show what you can do with a small group of people who are committed to that and are willing to carry that on. And we've given ourselves a list of things to work on from the conference on Friday. And I do have to say, getting together physically in a conference is a wonderful event.
Yeah.
I mean, I love these Zoom meetings, but it really is much better if you can physically meet a group of people.
Real spaces, real people.
And the point about the loss of spaces is really a very, very
exactly.
No, I agree. It's really powerful.
Exactly.
In the last 5-6 years, I'm checking I've got this right, Sharon, with the exception of presentations at 2 Yule's Katria conferences, very valuable, really interesting. It was only one other opportunity at a TUC West Midlands event where Sharon and I spoke face to face with Union Learn organisers. And that I agree entirely with Keith. And what we've done, Keith, is we've tried 2 or 3 times to look at pots of money to fund a face-to-face event and haven't been successful. But it's not through, because of those experiences, which we found really positive. We had hoped to do that. But I think the fact that we haven't been able to do it is itself a reflection of marketization. So, for example, where we've gone to 2 universities and tried to host those, not through the lack of interest from individuals, it's the structures that place charges on rooms and you know, that whole architecture. So I actually don't think that that's coincidental. I think that's kind of linked. And the fact that we were able to speak at that TUC West Midlands event in Birmingham was because there was a venue there where I'm assuming Matt, who was actually, interestingly, Matt does work partly, I think, for the West Midlands Combined Authority. They were able to host that event. So I think that is something we still have as an aspiration. And actually, I'm going to pause in a minute, but in October, we're scheduling, we plan to have a second, third event of the year, and that aspiration of that being face to face. And it would be really any ideas or suggestions on that would be very welcome, because I think for me, quick personal comment, it's been fascinating today I'd heard Keith begin to talk about that Never Stop Learning before. It echoes some of the previous comments around developments with the WA, but things like Linda's example from Bolton, it does show pockets, doesn't it, of things that are still being developed and sustained. Tim, do you want to take us to break? Do you want to ask a question, and then we'll perhaps just take a comfort?
Yeah, just a brief point of reflecting on what you just said, Ian. In the past, Adult Learning Wales have agreed to host an in-person event, which could also be available online. So let me know if you want me to re-explore that, and I will do that in the next couple of weeks.
Thanks a lot, Tim. I think it was partly our own personal circumstances changing as well. The shift. I was suddenly struggling to get any money from the university. I won't go into that for anything, not least my own travel. So I'll say no more.
Yeah,
it's more difficult to travel anywhere when you're not being supported.
And I know that conference organisers have found that, and I know Anil, who's on the call today from Warwick, that when we're looking at the Yule Scotrair conference, and I can certainly remember when I was at the University Trinity St David's, there was some support to attend events, and that was very welcome. But I think that whole issue of funding is interesting. But I think how Keith put that together with small pots of money. After today, I think we can draw on people's ideas. Sharon, is there anything you want to say just to wrap it up, this first part, and then we'll pause and then over to Linda and
no, just to say, please hang around, everybody. We're just gonna is it a 5-minute comfort break? Yeah, that's fine. I think that would be, please stay on the line though, don't, because the danger is clicking off and then finding yourself in the wilderness of Zoom. If such a thing exists. It's in my world.
So if that's okay with everybody, we'll pause for 5 minutes and then we'll rejoin. And we've got 2 presentations from Linda and Dani to look at their work. And I think there are certainly connections to some of these themes. So this has been a great first part of the session. So Sharon, thanks ever so much. It was all I thought it would be and more.
Oh, thank you.
Cheers.
Ian,
thank you all. Thank you all.
Ian,
see you in 5 minutes. I'll just.
Yes, Tim. I need to go somewhere. But
okay. Well, make sure you wash your hands. I was just going to say, if you can drop me a couple of lines about, a kind of overview of what the event will be about, and a possible couple of dates.
Yeah, I think we can. What as a follow up to today, I think it would be really good for me with Sharon and with other colleagues just to kind of knock this around and think about this, the pros and cons on format, venue, and so on. And I think because we've generated a lot of participation from colleagues in the north and south of Wales, I would be really interested in an event, and it would be great to meet up with colleagues and friends from Swansea as well. I think there are all sorts of reasons why it would be useful. I mean, not least post the Senate elections. I can see all sorts of reasons. That's just my initial take on it. So we'll get together. And I will definitely write back to you about that. I'm going to make myself notes. Okay, see you in a few minutes. Okay, Is everybody here? And okay, well, should we let's begin? Dani, you're going to thank you ever so much, and thanks. It's great that I had a chance to scan these slides yesterday and also look at Linda's, which were both absolutely fascinating. You're going to speak first and provide us with a context for your work and how it feeds into Linda's. So you're very welcome, Dani.
Brill. Right. So I'm Dani, as you all have heard, and I'm a project archivist at the Co-operative Heritage Trust, and I'm working on a project called Seeds of Change, which is a 2-year project funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. And I'm about halfway through now, so we're about a year in, so I thought it's a good opportunity to give an update. And before the update, I'll give a bit of an overview. So the Seeds of Change project is looking after the Co-operative College collection. So I'll give an overview of the Co-op College first, just so you get a good idea of why it's important, and then it helps give a bit of background to Linda's talk as well. I should probably sort of preface by saying, as I said to Sharon and Ian before this started, as an archivist, my job is more providing access to the collections, so I wouldn't call myself an expert. But luckily enough for me, I think we're joined by Linda, Tom, Mervyn, Scylla, I think Gillian's in there as well. So I've got resident experts on hand if need be. So the Co-op College was founded by the co-op movement, and it offered specialist learning to members and employees of the co-op societies who were primarily from working class backgrounds. And it wasn't just sort of targeted at national cooperators. It also had a very wide-reaching international reach to it as well. So it pioneered new forms of learning, and that included correspondence courses as well as visits to cooperatives. And so college life starts in Holyoke House in Manchester in 1919, and it wasn't the sort of huge purpose-built institution many had been hoping for, but it was a pragmatic beginning. And it mattered because it allowed education to start straight away. So it didn't hang about for the perfect conditions. And I will say as well that, well, Sharon had mentioned education has been one of the Rochdale pioneers, principles from the get-go. And so there was a desire for a co-op university for quite a while. And the reason that Holyoke House sort of came into being was as a result of the First World War. So it was like a memorial to those that had fallen. And so adult learners could pick subjects, attend evening classes while working, which is typical of early 20th century working class adult education. And as numbers grew, the limits of Holyoke House became clear. And so a hostel was developed in 1924. So it was only a tram ride away, and it gave students a place to live and study together. And it helped foster a sense of community and laid the foundations for the residential model that the Co-op College would later adopt. So I've put here, Holyoke House still matters today. So it's home to organisations like Cooperatives UK, but it's also home to the National Cooperative Archive, which is where this project and collection sits. And actually the archive search room is located in the old library, which feels like a really nice full circle moment. So during the Second World War, the top 2 floors of Holyoke House were destroyed. And what I think is quite striking here is there was an emphasis on protecting the records. So documents were moved into metal fireproof trunks. And so there's a recurring theme of education and memory worth being protecting, even in these most extreme circumstances. So in 1945, the college moves to Stamford Hall, near Loughborough, And that's partly due to the bomb damage that we just mentioned, but also because the college was outgrowing Manchester itself. And this is where it resided for almost 50 years. And this is then sort of harking back to what Sharon mentioned. The college develops a blend of social and intellectual education alongside more vocational topics like retail management and other specialist training for cooperative employees. And the physical scale of Stamford Hall is pretty immense. So it was a former stately home. I think in Tom and Linda's book on the Co-op College, it's described as a millionaire's mansion. So it had a 300+ seat theatre, tennis courts, swimming pool, cricket pitch, golf course, and it even had a seal pit, which I thought was quite an interesting find. And so it is interesting the contrast between radical working class education happening in this sort of setting, quite an elite setting. And so Stamford Hall wasn't just about British cooperators, as I mentioned, it became a genuinely international hub. Students arrived from India, Egypt, Canada, Sierra Leone, across the Commonwealth and beyond. And often this was through partnerships with the Colonial Office, which creates quite uncomfortable and complex histories. So the archives show the college is a site of global exchange and solidarity, but also its entanglement with colonial power structures. So it resonates quite strongly with current discussions about decolonising archives and education. And for me, and I think most archivists working on projects that are similar, it's about not smoothing these things over, acknowledging them and making them visible. So the college faced challenges during the 60s and 70s. It faced growing pressures as the movement itself began to decline. Retail competition, changing consumer habits, and internal fragmentation affected funding and relevance. There was tension between traditional cooperative ideals and the need to modernise. But despite this, the college continued to adapt, offering new training programmes and expanding international work. But sadly, by the late 1990s, Stamford Hall becomes financially unsustainable, and the college returned to Holyoke House in the 2000s. And it marks a shift away from residential education to more of a distance learning model. So it's the end of one era, but it's also a moment of reinvention. So from an archival perspective, this moment generates a huge volume of material about identity, uncertainty, and transition, especially in the sort of more business administrative records. So I've put here why the Co-op College matters. So it documents how democratic adult education was actually practiced and not just theorised. The archive captures student voices, curricula, teaching methods, international exchanges, and everyday learning experiences. So preserving and opening this material allows researchers and communities to reconnect with, as Sharon calls it, a lost space of experimental, values-driven adult education. So I thought I'd also mention here that very sadly, up until recently, the college was still functioning on this distance learning model, but it's no longer able to deliver services or operate. The governance is still undecided, but a conclusion is going to be determined by a member vote later in June. So it's a very sad time, I think, but the timing of the project itself is pretty, it's nice in a way because we get to capture this part of the transition and also take in some of the more contemporary records as well, and really make sure that this is all recorded. So I'll tell you a bit more about the project now. So Seeds of Change. So yeah, it's a 2-year project. It's delivered by the Cooperative Heritage Trust. It's focused on the Co-operative College collection, and it's held at the National Cooperative Archive in Manchester. So at its core, the project's about recovering, preserving and making accessible the history of the Co-operative College, an institution that played a key role in working class, democratic and international adult education across the 20th century. And the collection has a real breadth of records. So it's what you'd imagine from like a university collection. So there's course materials, administrative records, student files, teaching resources, audiovisual, records on the international development material. But then there's also a really human aspect to it. So the records document the student life and experience as well. So we've got some really cool student scrapbooks, student magazines, photo albums, that kind of thing. So the three main objectives of the project are to fully catalogue the collection. So we want to create a clear, accessible catalogue. We want to improve physical preservation through things like rehousing the collection and conservation. And we want to ensure the collection is sustainable for long-term use. We want to improve the access to the collection. So we want to identify material for digitisation, make the collection more usable for researchers, and address sensitive material responsibly. And lastly, we want to reconnect the collection to people and communities. So we're developing outreach events, talks, creative workshops. We're recording oral histories with alumni and staff, and we're going to be working towards a public exhibition. So here's a little bit of an update 1 year in on how we're getting on. I thought I'd give a little bit of this bit of background at first. So before me, so I started in September last year, there was another project archivist working on the project, but they found a permanent position. So they were there for around 4 months. So when they first started, I think the main tasks were sort of establishing what we had and where it was, because it's just a lot of boxes, as you can see in the background of this picture, that might just say college question mark on it. So determining what was what. What else was there? What was what, where it was, how much there was to tackle, and sort of they came up with the approach towards the task. But then when I took over, my then challenge was not only information gathering on what is a co-op, what is the co-op college, but also how has the previous person approached this. So trying to get in their head and understand where they were going with things. So the first phase focused on building strong foundations. So I've come up with a new cataloguing structure and a scheme of arrangement. And we're using this approach called more product, less process. So that means that as one of the objectives is cataloguing the entire collection, it might not be that we're going down into item level details. So it's not going to be that every single photograph is catalogued or described. It will be that it's more series level. And then that means if there's time towards the end, we can go back in and sort of go down into the minutiae. So it's going to mean that there's enough detail to support meaning and access without creating barriers to progress. So far, over 100 boxes have been box listed, 300 item level records have been created, and the cataloguing and the rehousing are happening together, so preservation improves alongside description. Conservation and digital preservation. So basic remedial conservation is taking place in-house. So that's things like rehousing in acid-free files, so taking them out of box files, removing rusty paper clips, quarantining anything that's mouldy. So then items needing specialist treatment are being logged, and a full conservation consultation took place a couple of weeks ago, so we're just waiting on their report. So that'll be to stabilize the sort of priority items, so items that we think will be of most they're going to be the things that are most requested by researchers, like the scrapbooks. And then because of, as I said, the disruption to the college as well as to the project archive post, some things in the project have been moved forward and some have been rearranged. So one of those things is the digital records from the college were planned on being digitally preserved at the end of the project, but that's been brought forward. So I've come up with a digital preservation workflow, and we've already received a couple of digital donations from them. And digitisation is being approached selectively, so we're prioritising fragile material with strong research or outreach value. And then we've also got volunteers working on the project, and actually this is something I think maybe you'll all find quite interesting. The volunteers that we currently have are from an organisation in Manchester called Back on Track, which supports people who have lived experiences with homelessness, addiction, mental health, or have been in prison. And so they're an organisation that focuses on community learning and also providing holistic support. So they have courses on things like employability, functional and life skills, but they also do things like a heritage course. And so they went round for different visits around different heritage organisations in Manchester. And as a result, we got 3 volunteers out of it, which is really nice. And so it's nice to work with volunteers and give them the opportunity if they've not worked in a heritage sort of sector or environment before. So we've been upskilling them. So they've got box listing training, digitisation, stuff for like communications, so blog post writing, things for newsletters and social media, and also basic conservation. And there'll also be an opportunity for oral history training as well. So then the outreach and oral history side of things, we've been doing public talks like this one now. I did one with Linda last November in Huddersfield, and then I think there was the book launch for Tom and Linda's book. There's also going to be some creative workshops, and they'll be inspired by the collections. So this will be stuff like using the student scrapbooks to then get the general public in to do a scrapbooking workshop or a zine workshop. I think we're also going to be doing a pub quiz inspired by the exam questions, because we've got loads of exam question books. So I think that will be quite funny. Maybe a bit of a challenge to make it cooperative themed, but open to the general public. So that's a little challenge that I'll work out soon. There's also going to be an exhibition, like I said, at Manchester Central Library, and that's going to be in January 2027. And lastly, there's the oral history. So that's planned for this next coming year, but we've put, call it a steering group, but basically Linda, Scylla, Mervyn and Gillian got together with me and we came up with a list of potential candidates for the oral history. So we're just waiting on getting some oral history training for a group of volunteers to carry this out. But there's also a strong connection with Sharon's project. So she has interviewed some staff herself. So instead of doubling up on the efforts, we're just going to be connecting the projects and directing people there. And then lastly, I've just put in about the finds and stories. So I've already mentioned the scrapbooks and the student magazines, but they really do humanise the collection. They highlight issues students were concerned with and their active engagement with wider social movements. So they rallied around a really wide range of like campaigns. One of them included nuclear disarmament. But one of the other, I think this is maybe my favourite so far, is I've put here the blog post. So someone got in touch with the archive wanting to donate their father's materials that she'd found. So he was called Sidney Pucknell. Unfortunately, they either fell outside of our collecting remit, or it was things that we already had in the collection. But what I thought would be really nice is to sort of get his story out there in the form of a blog post instead. And so we used materials that his daughter sent over to me, and I kind of came up with this sort of biographical blog post. And I thought, oh, it'd be good if we can use the collection to sort of bolster this. So at random, I chose a photograph out of the thousands of photographs we have of sort of the time period Sidney would have been at the college. And it's actually this photograph in the background of this slide. And I realised he's actually in the photograph. So he's the man that's looking at the shelves just under the word fines. And so that was really special. I got to share that with his daughter. And she said she'd never seen him looking so studious. And then that led me to then utilise the scrapbooks. And I found extra information on him that his daughter didn't know either. So he was on the catering committee. And so in one of the scrapbooks, the catering committee had come up with quite a funny poem, and there was a group picture of them all together. So yeah, it was really lovely being able to share that with his daughter, and then also publicly, and she's passed it around to her family. And so I think it's just a nice, wholesome spin on what maybe could be considered as like a not impersonal collection, but maybe from the outside looking in, that might be what you think. But yeah, I think that concludes my project update, really.
Thanks, Dani. Sharon, I'm going to pass over to Sharon in a minute, but can I just ask, lastly, the link to your blog, could you send that so we could send that around to everybody?
Yeah,
that would be really interesting. As part of the follow-up, we'll send links to the work of the commission, but that would be really interesting.
Yeah.
Lynn, and then we're going to pass to Sharon and Linda.
Thank you. Just very quickly, that was brilliant, Dani. Very, very interesting. And I was really drawn to your comment, in inverted commas, not smoothing things over, which I do think is absolutely essential for any archive.
Yeah.
Sorry there's nobody from Scotland on here, because the Scots were recently, WA, about 2 years ago, asked to put their archives together, which of course they realised that certain documents might be lost or left out.
Yeah.
So one very ingenious member has found a way of including them in the Glasgow archives.
Oh, amazing.
So, you know, there's anarchy within archives.
Yeah.
And long may it last.
I think that is definitely one of the things with archives is sort of invisible or hidden voices. And I think anyone that works in heritage knows that it's usually it feels a bit brutal to say, but the straight white man is the voice that's usually heard. So even if there's a woman in the collections, sometimes she's just referred to so-and-so's wife. So yeah, it's really nice to share the collection, and I think it's going to be a great way to engage with local communities as well, because they're going to be able to see themselves in the collection as well.
Excellent. And also there might be documents that the association might not want to be included.
Yeah.
That shows the rigour of the democratic voice.
Definitely. Thanks, Lynn.
Really good point. Scilla.
Thank you. Just very briefly, probably everyone on this call already knows, but Dani, that was fantastic. But for those of you who don't know about the provenance, the roots, the history, the enormity of cooperative education and the link it has to this commission, the earlier commission's work that Ian was talking about before, I've got a copy of the report here, just a big hefty tome. And as we always note, by the time this came out in 1919, I'd say about a half of the adult education that is discussed in here is rooted in the cooperative movement, probably more than half actually. And it's just a really timely reminder of how enormous that history is, you know, whether it's about learning how to be a cooperator and run great shops and, you know, outcompete in the true sense of the word capitalism, but also the values and principles of being a cooperator. So, it's just a really interesting reminder of the enormity of that movement. So, Dani, it's a fantastic project, and thanks so much for telling us about it.
Definitely. Thanks, Scylla.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Scylla. Yeah, really important. I think that I was overwhelmed by the sheer historical weight of the cooperative movement. I couldn't believe it when I realized just what the power and influence had been. So yeah, goes back to the point about erasure as well, doesn't it, that we were talking about, and avoiding that at all costs. So thanks for that. I'm gonna move on, if I may, to inviting Linda to speak, and just to introduce Linda first. Linda's been a really important part of the cooperative movement. She's worked in adult education for most of her working life, from what she's told us, and has worked for the WEA, the Open University, the University of Manchester, and obviously the Cooperative College. And she was originally an historian, but she's also worked in international development and ethical trade, which I find really interesting. And more recently, of course, as has been mentioned, she's obviously been working on the history of cooperative education, and last year, of course, published the co-authored book with Tom on the history of the Cooperative College. So with no further ado, I'll hand over to let me see, are we there? Can you see my slides
yes,
now?
thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was just wanting to. Right, okay, so I'm going to pass over to you, please, Linda. I'm just going to try and.
Thanks, Sharon. I say it's still good morning, just good morning, everyone. Nice to be here. Can everyone hear me? Are we okay with that?
Yep.
I'm assuming, yeah. Great. Okay. I'm going to, in a way, pick up not exactly where Dani's left, but I took what Sharon's project, thinking around that issue of cooperative education being so critical. And I took to heart the issue around lost spaces and untold stories. So I'm going to start with some reflections on the college and the college's, the way that the college delivered and provided education. And I'm reflecting really on, I think, firstly, some positive aspects, but also some of the kind of weaknesses around college provision, particularly with in relation to women's education. And that took me on a bit of a journey, really, looking at the wider landscape for women's education in terms of the cooperative movement. And that eventually led also to a connection with the WEA. So I kind of start with the college, but I kind of move into the broader landscape. So that's really my thinking around the talk. If you could move down perhaps to slide 3, Sharon, that would be great. Thank you. Yeah, so I wanted to look at, and I think Tom and Keith and I may kind of need to rethink. We've just been thinking around this issue of some of the unique features of the colleges, and I think there's probably more commonality with some of the other adult residential colleges, but I think it's that's something we need to look at. How distinct was the college? We argue in the book that especially when the college moved to Stamford Hall in the decades following World War II, we see this kind of distinctiveness of the college as fed by its relationship as part of the cooperative movement, and also its residential nature, which other colleges, of course, shared. And it would be interesting to unpack those differences and similarities. But also, I think that one of the major differences at the college has been the continued presence of a large cohort of overseas students, initially, and this goes back to 1919, and it was more perhaps, no, it was pretty apparent in the decades of the 20s and 30s. Very early on, the college had overseas students, then obviously from the colonies, but not just from the colonies, but also into the post-war period. That presence continued, And that also, I think, helps shape the educational experiences and learning at the college. Can we just move down to the next one, please? And again, this is something I think we could do with a lot more unpacking. But I mean, we argue that education has, historically largely eschewed technical training in the UK. That it's been focused more on kind of the liberal approach. But Marshall, who was the principal of the college for a good, I think, 30 years, a very key figure in the development of the college, very influential, was the principal, viewed vocational education as a route into the education of the whole person. And this was really an important element in the college's approach, so that they needed not just to learn, students would learn not just about the technical aspects of their role as cooperative employees. And I need to say at this point that the primary route that led to becoming a residential student for the UK students was being an employee of a cooperative society. And I think that probably does differentiate it quite strongly from other residential colleges. So you would have people, younger, not so young, but younger people who were working for the many, in those days, many local cooperative societies would come to the college for a 1 or a 2 year programme. But this programme, I think importantly, as Dani's mentioned, grounded the students not just in what we see as the technical aspects of their role, whether that was bookkeeping or retail sales, but also a very strong grounding in what we now call values and principles of the co-op movement. In those days, it was called the larger purpose. So you would get both a kind of vocational element to the education provided, but also philosophy, history of cooperation, wider understanding of the movement. And it was that blend that we think was not just, perhaps not unique to the college, was a very strong and a very positive feature of the college. I would add, with reference to colleague from resided in the Netherlands, that I did many years ago now, and I don't know whether the situation is still the same, visit adult provision in the Netherlands, and found there, we were quite surprised to find that they too had a very strong liberal element in their vocational programs. And it wasn't just the 1 or 2 hours of general studies that we used to get in the UK at technical FE colleges, but it was a much more in-depth approach, involved philosophy and history, not dissimilar to what the college was pioneering. And this blend of liberal and vocational education was linked to the way that the cooperative movement wanted to educate the whole person. It also has been described as the development of a cooperative character. So you weren't just learning things in an abstract way, you were actually building character. That whole person approach was really very significant. But not, and this, if we could have the next slide, this links to a point made earlier, which is that as far as I know, and I could be corrected on this, we need to do far more work in the archives, the overseas students who came, who were essentially being trained as civil servants to work for government cooperative departments. And this was both in colonial and post-colonial days, had a very different curriculum. They, shared the halls, they shared the meals, they shared life at the college, but the courses were different. And from what I understand of the courses provided, that they didn't have this specifically vocational element. I mean, I think in part due to the, strength of the fact that the UK movement was largely consumer cooperatives, and so the vocational work was very much focused on that rather than on, the kind of co-ops that the overseas students would be going back to, well, in fact, manage, supervise, audit, which would probably more likely be, agricultural co-ops or credit unions. This did change at the college, I think, from the 1970s onwards, where you get more specific courses around, you know, running a credit union, running an agricultural co-op, and shorter courses for that reason, more focused courses. But until then, the overseas students learned about cooperatives. They had the same kind of values and principles, history of the movement, philosophy, different kinds of co-ops, legal background. All that kind of approach was central, but not, in fact, the vocational side. So that's a big but. And it led me into a reflection really on to that the college wasn't unique in having a kind of cohort of overseas students, colonial, post-colonial civil servants, essentially. Interestingly enough, for example, Manchester University ran similar courses, although, of course, the students were not focused particularly on the cooperative movement. And interestingly enough, they evolved into departments of international development studies. This was Manchester University of Sussex, and then the college, of course, didn't take that trajectory for, you know, reasons that might be discussed. But it is also true that development studies, as in my experience, has never really included any hands-on elements, vocational elements around development, how to run a project management, you know, that kind of legal framework. It's always been about development, history, theory, different approaches, and so on. But anyway, so the overseas students were in a separate box for that. But the UK students, and I've got a couple of pictures in the next slide, Sharon, if you could, one of which I think we've already seen, but it's and I apologise for the quality, but on the right is the mock-up of the supermarket as been shown. On the left, I think, is a discussion around I think the labour issues. There's a kind of two sides there and an intermediary in the middle, and the students are learning, or, you know, going through a role play around a labour dispute or resolving a labour dispute. Could we go on to the next slide, please? And again, I think, as with the other colleges, the residential nature of the college, and I think we have to, as been mentioned before, you know, help provide a really stimulating pedagogical environment with the students. So you have both the formal classes, you have individual tuition, project work, visits, informal dialogue, and this did apply to the overseas students as well. It wasn't just for the UK ones. So it was a whole collegiate atmosphere. Scylla's commented on the overseas students. It wasn't always without its issues, as we mentioned in the book. I mean, there's some of the comments that are pretty well casual racism, if you like, some of the uncertainty, some of the difficulties around colonialism. I don't want to skate over that. But it was a space for dialogue. It was that face-to-face space to discuss and to disagree, which I think, again, was just mentioned. So if we scroll down again, a couple of pictures of the students. You can see one's from the 1950s and the others from the 1979. Slightly more smartly dressed in the 50s and 70s than the 70s, but you can see the presence of the overseas students quite, you know, clearly there. But what's the other issue that pops out? Well, it pops out at me, and I hope for it's pretty clear as well, is the lack of women students at the college. So this is moving on to what I see as a less successful aspect of the college, which is the few women who attended the college. If you look at this picture of 1913, you'll see that this is one of the pre-college summer schools, and there are a reasonable number of women there. You know, they do have a presence, and there were hopes before the college started that the college could offer a route for women as well as male students, although Margaret Llewellyn Davis, who was then General Secretary of the Co-operative Guild, did raise some serious questions about this before it happened. But in fact, to no avail. If we could move down. The number of women students at the college really never rose much more, at least until the 1970s, and possibly Mervyn could add a bit more about the 80s. And I've checked the numbers really up to the 70s, where women consistently made up less than 10% of the residential students, and it was sometimes closer to 5%. So it's a very male atmosphere, very, shirts very formal in that sense. And I think what's striking to me when I was looking back on what we'd written was, it is occasionally commented on in student publications, and we have to say again, women students were both critical but also complicit in the whole set of gendered assumptions around, what roles for men and women. As far as I can see, the issue was never really seriously or consistently addressed over quite a long period. Again, I don't know I know we had specific women's college, adult residential colleges. I was thinking about the reasons behind this low numbers, and I came up with several, which were, well, obviously you've got an overall declining cooperative sector. There were always problems about recruitment from societies. There were scholarships, but societies also funded their staff to come on the programmes, and the numbers, the recruitment was often and always became later more of an issue for the students from cooperative employees. I think you'd then have to say there were, and until recently, I think it's been the case, there were few women who achieved any sort of effective heights or positions in co-op management. And I think to an extent a democratic movement that fell behind the times around women's engagement. Certainly when I joined the college around 2000, early 2000s, went to a co-op Congress, I was a bit, in fact, shocked by. It felt, about 30 years behind in terms of women's engagement and attitudes. I would also add, of course, you can see that there were very few women on the colonial, post-colonial students courses for students. And again, it would be useful to have any thoughts on, whether the college was alone in women finding the time commitment for residential courses problematic, given the set of assumptions around their domestic responsibilities. It was commented on at the time. If we can move on to the next slide, there are a couple of things here. Only one woman student at the college, 8 girls isolated with 100 males from 1955. Thanks, Dani, for those. And I think perhaps ironic is not the word, if we could move on to the next slide, because actually, when you look at the wider cooperative education landscape, as has been mentioned before, by 1919, the co-op movement was a leader in the provision of women's education. And especially for women, and this is the argument of the second part of the paper really, is that adult education for women has thrived within the cooperative movement particularly, I would argue, through the work of the Cooperative Women's Guild, especially in the first half of the century. And I really strongly think that we need to situate the cooperative movement as a significant pioneer of adult education for women. And I think one of the problems about, and I think this is a hidden story or an untold story, is that I did, as Dani and I did a session for Huddersfield Local History Society, and of course when I was doing some work for that, I realised we just don't have many studies of local co-op guild activities. the studies that we have of the Co-op Women's Guild tend to be more at the kind of national level, look at national issues, national questions. I mean, it's all great stuff, but it was at the local level where most of this educational activity took place. Can we move on, please? Thanks. Just for those of you that don't know much about the Co-op Women's Guild, set up in 1883, and it really did provide, I think, it's arguably a unique space for working class women. So local societies would have their own guilds, and at its height in the 1930s, the Co-op Women's Guild had over 87,000 members in over 1,800 branches. That's 1,800 branches that provided for adult education for its members. I think it's an incredible story that needs, further recognition. How did it do this? Well, if we could move on, thanks. I think local cooperative societies, and it's this thing about space, it provided an absolutely vital home. They provided spaces for women to meet. Most co-op societies, even the very smallest ones, would have a co-op room or a co-op hall. And this, I think, has to be the starting point. They provided physical space for the women to meet. Many societies provided funding and support, obviously in rooms, but also sometimes financial support. And how did they work at the local level? Well, the Co-op Women's Guild branches would they'd hold meetings. And okay, they had social activities, sing songs, cards, outings, tea parties, but they also involved more explicit, in quotes, educational and campaigning aspects. They might fundraise for local charities. They had discussions. They often considered issues to their own society, such as, price and quality of goods, employment issues. And they also worked to influence the wider movement. Co-op policies and out. And I mean, they had a very radical social agenda. They were very radical on issues such as birth control, divorce, suffrage. All these issues were discussed, debated, and fed into the wider movement and outside. So you had both the kind of formal and informal learning going on, women learning how to speak, how to run meetings, how to engage, how to go out into the public spaces and argue their cases. Could we have the next slide, please? And they also had formal education. They often had speakers, day and weekend schools. Topics included women's work in local government, including poor law guardians, suffrage, particularly health, and I'll come back to this. Of course, being part of the cooperative movement, they learned about the wider cooperative movement, the role of Robert Owen and trade unions, and they brought together, this informal and formal learning in terms of structures, talks and activities. If we could scroll down. So here's an example, Women's Guild, a series of health lectures in the cooperative hall, as I've said. I don't quite know where this one is, but the example I give next to it is Bolton Co-op. We do have a master's thesis on the Bolton Co-op Women's Guild, and it shows how it fueled by education, by opening clinics, by campaigning, a dramatic rate of decline in infant mortality rates in the town from 148 per thousand births in 1908 to 6 per thousand in 1923. I mean, it's just a credible achievement. We don't know the activities of other local women's guilds, but I'm sure it's very rich. There's a very rich background there to pick up on. So health particularly was very good. And the final point of my talk is this then led me to revisit. I'd done some work many years ago when I worked for the WEA during the second wave of women's education in the 80s. I looked at the way that the Co-op Women's Guild and the WEA both fed into this pre-First World War landscape, and they both worked together to promote women's education. And this partnership, again, I don't think is widely known. So the WA would help provide lectures for the Co-op Women's Guild meetings. Obviously, the various lecturers came, you know, from the co-op movement or the precursor, the co-op union, but also they came from the WEA. And a representative from the co-op union sat on the WEA's National Women's Advisory Committee, which had been set up in 1907 to promote women's classes, but again, crucially, not just in the WEA, but with a range of local organisations such as girls' clubs, the Co-op Women's Guild, any group that comes together could approach the WA for a speaker. And the membership of the Women's Advisory Committee, and I don't have time to go into it, but included the members from the Women's Trade Union League, the National Federation of Women Workers, Morley College, Federation of Girls Clubs. You know, a very, I'd say powerful, but very effective, I think, committee. And the quote that we've got from the Women's Committee minutes, and I'm afraid we only just, well, when I was doing the work, there was only one volume available, but it was, wherever there is a little group of women who are ready to study, if only for a short time, or who are desirous of having a single talk on some one subject, the WEA will do its best to provide them with a teacher or lecturer. This, again, gift in our hand was something I redug out of my old documents. 1912, which a publication from the WEA, which urged the setting up of women's sections at branch and district level, and argues the case very strongly for less formal and exacting classes by women, you know, by comparison to the, I won't say standard, but the 3-year tutorial model, which recognise the experience that women brought with them. And that's the quote, gift in her hand, that working class women brought this experience with them. By 1912, there were a large, in quotes, I don't know the numbers exactly, of all classes being run. There was a full-time organiser at for the Women's Advisory Committee from 1910. And by 1913, there were 33 women's committees. Again, 1912, gift in her hand, there were few branches which failed to give attention to women's work. So it's a very strong and vibrant picture that emerges of provision of adult education for women at the local level by both the Co-op Women's Guild and the WEA, and I think it does deserve more research and recognition. The annual report, Highway, also the annual report records classes all over the UK. Birmingham Women's Section had 340 members, 30 lectures for women's organisations. Chorley, childcare classes, average attendance of 50. Bristol, study circle lectures with 46 women's organisations. That's just, you know, it's just some of the examples I've found. We could just move on. I'm almost finished now to the next. But, and I never really got to the bottom. Well, I'm not convinced I've got to the bottom of this. This all comes to certainly a sudden end in the WEA. So by 1915, we see that the Co-op Union is no longer on the Women's Committee. 1916, the national organiser leaves and is not replaced. And the following year, the Women's Advisory Committee seems to have ceased to function. So it has a very sudden stop. There's some evidence that women's programmes continued at district level, but, you know, no one's really done the work. But we know some of it happened in London and in the Southern District where I was based. It may be to do with the fact that the increasing focus on work with trade unions that the WEA had following the appointment of McTavish as General Secretary. And of course, the pre-war women's movement lost momentum in the 1920s. So you get a sudden halt to that. Last slide also, thanks. Co-op Women's Guild, as I say here, does continue to operate very successfully, really, from the 20s and 30s. So still continuing to offer that kind of education for women. We know, I was part of it, women's education enjoyed a revival in the 70s and 80s. The college has continued to offer that mix, well, you know, until recently, the mix of vocational and technical education. And my main point here is I think that we can enrich the histories of adult education with more research and understanding the role of the cooperative movement and the WA in making large-scale provision for working women, which recognise the importance of informal learning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda. That was incredibly rich. I wonder if anyone would like to follow on. I was particularly struck by the theme around women's education, which has been a key theme in several of my interviews as well, particularly with WEA colleagues. I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but I just wondered if anyone wanted to reflect back at all to Linda's presentation. I'm sorry I've not had a chance to catch up with the chat because I've been looking at the slides and sorting those out. So I'm just doing that now. Any comments and thoughts right now?
Can I just make a couple of quick comments that
Yes, please.
that follow straight on? Linda, in respect of some of what the guild branches were doing, it takes me back to my earliest days with the London Co-op in the 70s, when we were still providing a lecture service for the about 100 branches of the Cooperative Women's Guild in there at the time. Now, for someone who wants to do some ferreting, and this may be Dani or Scylla, I remember when the guild was in one of its periods of decline and was giving it up its Walthamstow headquarters, I personally cleared out its basement because it had in its rules were that when a branch closed, its banner and its records had to go to the guild head office. And I removed lots of those. The banners, of course, are part of the Cooperative Heritage Trust collection these days. But the minute books, and these were often handwritten minute books, went to the Bishopsgate Institute, which is where we'd worked with Stan Newens that I did many years ago. We'd put the records of the London Cooperative Society. I don't think any researchers ever tried to have a look at those, and it may well be worth a good look. The other specific point for Dani to look at, and picking up from Linda. Sorry?
Oh, sorry, I don't know what that is, Mervyn.
Oh, okay, if I can just carry on.
Yeah.
Really interested about the gender mix at the college, and going back again to the 70s, 80s, early 90s. There's one bit that I don't think we've ever adequately looked at, which is that the cooperative bank, which was thriving at the time, had a separate block, residential block built at Stanford Hall. And my memories of that are that it completely transformed the gender mix that you saw at the lunch times, etc., because they were overwhelmingly women from the bank in there. And numerically, they dwarfed other parts of the college on a Monday to Friday basis. The reason I know this is because I was using that same residential block then at weekends for members' courses on that. But I've never seen any stats or any of the figures, you know, because they frequently had at least 2 courses running in parallel on the Monday to Friday basis, and be really well worth seeing if from anywhere there was any records of those at all.
Thank you, Mervyn. I don't know if anyone wants to come back on that. Wilma, I think I saw your hand up, please.
Yes, thank you. I can't work out how to do that little wavy thingy, but anyway, thanks, Linda. Thanks ever so much. I don't know how you and I didn't cross in the 80s, because I was in the WEA from the early 80s through till 2003, and I was the Southeast rep on the National Women's Education Committee, which took over from the Women's Advisory Committee that you were talking about. And I'm just so fascinated to hear what you're saying, because you mentioned A Gift in Our Hand, which was a 1912 publication. 3 of us on the Women's Education Committee rewrote that in about 1980, maybe the 1990s. And blow me, if anybody's got a copy of it, I would love it. I can't find it. It was published. But also, I think...
I've got one, if you...
Pardon?
I've got one.
Yay!
Is that the one by Scarlett Fraser and Winner?
No, it's the one, the
Oh,
WEA one in Eileen Aird.
I think
no, we rewrote. Never mind. We wrote
Anyway,
a gift
okay.
in our hand in the 90s. But I think this is one of those wonderful things that's come up for me today in all of the talks is okay, talking about nostalgia, talking about memories, but also the desperate need to find and find a home for all of the archival material that is scattered everywhere. I have a filing cabinet which is full of branch meetings. I was tutor organizer in East Kent, and I have branch meetings going back to the 1930s, including minutes of one of the minors' courses, the first, and I think it's the longest class, it was the longest class running in the country at the time. Where am I to put all this stuff?
Yeah, exactly.
The women's education that Linda was talking about, and suggesting that there was a kind of a diminution or a dip. Yes, there was a dip, but certainly in my time in the WEA, 1980s, 1990s, and up until 2003, women's education was thriving. I ran a national women and health program with the local health promotion service, and times were good. They are not now. But the fact that that gap in our story seems to be so pronounced, I think is hugely sad for me to hear. And Linda, I would love to give you all my stuff. Enough said.
Fantastic. Thank you, Wilma.
Just a quick response. I was involved in the 80s in women's education in the WA. It was more the 20s and the 30s stroke, that post-war period as well. I think we had a resurgence in the late 70s and into the 80s with parallel to the women's movement. That's really what I was trying to say. But I agree, it was a very rich period.
Brilliant. Does anyone else want to come in? Thank you so much, and thanks, Wilma. Wilma and I had the most fascinating interview, and I'm really excited about the kind of development, the work around women's education, which I knew very little about, I must admit, in its earlier kind of incarnation. So thank you, Linda, as well. Anyone want to comment further on any of the presentations, really, or just continue the discussions, which I think have been very rich?
Can I say something, Sharon?
Yes, please, John.
I mean, I agree that the presentations have been fascinating, including your own, of course. And I just wanted to pick up on Wilma's point about the location, about the records that she has, and I mean, I feel for you in this because I have recently moved house, Wilma, and that involved discarding a great many, or finding homes, let me put it that way, for a great many records of bits and pieces that have come to me over the years, including a lot of stuff on adult education in Kent, as you can imagine. And I have given some of it to the local, I think, to the University of Kent archives. I can't now remember. And so there is also I mean, apart from the central location, there's also the one of giving it to local records offices or local universities. And I mean, there are various options, but they do all have these awful collection strategies, which generally say we don't want the material unless it's especially relevant to what our contemporary strategy is. But that's one point. The other thing is just an anecdote, but I can remember from the 1980s in relation to the Cooperative Women's Guild. I can remember when I was in Kent in the WEA in the 80s. This was it. I was well connected. Well, I was connected with through my political activities with, and I hesitate not, of course, through the WEA, but with a fascinating woman who must have been about 50 years older than I was. But she was a communist and deeply involved in the Cooperative Women's Guild, and it was a very important part of her political activity at the time. And I could never quite understand this at the time, but I'm seeing more of it in the light of what Linda had to say, and also in the light, I suppose, of life and seeing how important things are.
Do you remember her name, John?
I do indeed. Nina Drongin. I mean, she and I wish I could tell you more about her, but she's certainly dead now. She was, amongst many other things, she was I think the secretary of the Labour Party in Chatham when Hugh Gaitskell was the Labour candidate for the area. But she later joined the Communist Party, and that was a big part. That was where she remained for the remainder of her life. But she was deeply influential well, she was deeply committed to politics in Chatham and Kent.
And I'll bring Cilla in, but I just wanted to add to that as well, because during my time working at Mansfield Council for Voluntary Services, I got to know at the time someone in the 90s, Ida Hackett, who I guess people may not have heard of, but she's quite famous in this area of the world, sort of North Notts, because she was a very active Communist Party right up into her 90s, and also became a political leader for the Pensions Action Association. And it just really made me think about that connection between the political and the civil society that we touched on earlier on, and that Barry alluded to as well, and the importance of women in that movement as well. And I'd very much like to dig out my old cassette recordings of her from about 1,000,000 years ago and see if I can find them and see if they could be sort of digitized or put into a more contemporary format, because I think there's something really powerful about that political civil society role of women, particularly in the CP. Cilla.
Thank you very much, and obviously just to reiterate my thanks so much to Linda and Dani. It's such a it's a published. There's some publications around all this, but it's that its importance is. I mean, I just think the Guild is totally undervalued. I just wanted to share a very quick personal reflection. I've inherited my grandmother's diaries, and I've talked to Sharon about this many times. My grandmother was a very active member of the Cooperative Women's Guild in Liverpool and Waterloo. And she recorded how she had her Esperanto classes that ran through the Women's Guild. And they started doing them once they felt that war was coming in 1938. 39, and I just wanted to make that point. So of course they were involved in a lot of what you call sort of domestic, so for example the sort of health issues that Linda identified, but also there was that global vision as well, that global idea of peace. It was very much tied in with, as you know, Peace Pledge Union, Independent Labour Party, the sort of a lot of early sort of anti-war communism as well, and the idea of Esperanto classes, which she and other guild members ran informally in the house in Brunswick Parade in Waterloo, was something they wanted to do to sort of as activists, as peace activists. And I just think it's that's another huge, I just happened to get hold of that diary. But that's something that was going on in Waterloo, in the street I was born in. I would never have known about that if I hadn't have come across that diary. So how many other streets and houses and roads, it's just a good example, isn't it, of how it's so important to keep these things. Anyway.
Absolutely. Thank you, Cilla. And Greg. I think you're muted still, Greg.
I was just going to. I was saying it's possibly a slightly garbled contribution because there's so many things flying through my head from the presentations and the stuff that you've given today, which have all been really excellent and stimulating. But I was kind of taken in your presentation, Sharon, with the decline of adult education, and a couple of things that was striking me was that the point that somebody, I think from Bolton raised about the group there. I've just recently joined an adult learning class in the Wirral, which has got a really sort of vibrant. I don't actually know the structure of the organisation. It's certainly been self-set up. And has got sort of classes taking place every day of the week, and it seems to me maybe 7 or 8 classes morning and afternoon every day of the week there, which I'm been really surprised to find. So there may be, as we said, a series of spaces going on where people are trying to put some of that stuff together, particularly associated with community centres, church halls, places where there's the old problem of finding venues. I thought that was quite interesting. And then partly through some of my personal circumstances at the minute, I'm beginning to want to find activities that are taking place. I'm looking at things like Eventbrite, and in Liverpool over the next month there's a Writing on the Wall festival, which has always had a radical tinge to it, which has got a series of speakers coming to talk, and similarly from the university, I've particularly been following the Liverpool University's Irish department, which also seems to run a vibrant programme of sort of lectures and talks around some of the stuff, and it's just trying to. There is no places to bring some of that thing together, and then you've got a whole series of voluntary activities which are just setting up and advertising on Eventbrite and seeing what they get, and I think that's some quite interesting spaces. And then kind of thinking back over my own history, I sort of, my kind of earliest recollection of study classes was as a member of the Labour Party Young Socialists, which at that time was fairly heavily influenced by the militant tendency, and a whole series of discussion groups. I think I was about 15 or 16 going along to Marxist discussion groups at the time, which were, I think, pretty fundamental in some of the things, in some of the learning that took place in those groups. There was some quite in-depth study of classical socialist literature and stuff like that, and socialist ideas and things. And I know that was taking place in the Communist Party. I know that there were a range of other, particularly after the 68 of left organisations that were doing that, more or less all of which have totally disappeared. The sort of idea of education in the Labour Party almost seems laughable at the minute, and at the point at which you feel with the rise of. I did see recently an initiative from an old colleague about trying to get some stuff together in relation to reform, but you would be thinking about the need for a political education programme, that partly because of the danger of fascism and the fact that we're not seeing any significant response to the danger of fascism. So it's a slightly garbled approach, but it's just kind of thinking the presentations have started me off there, in a whole range of directions to think about some of this stuff and what existed and what we know and the archives and all the rest of that. That you think, there's just so much material and also so many ideas for things that we need to take forward or to try to take forward.
Exactly, and it is about that kind of restoration rather than going back to the points earlier about nostalgia versus kind of of learning from history for activism purposes. And just on an optimistic note, from my other role as chair of the Raymond Williams Foundation, we're routinely giving out small grants, £1,000, £1,500, sometimes a bit less, to small self-organised adult education groups and organisations across the country, but particularly this kind of flourishing in Wales. And these are younger organisations, not necessarily in terms of the age of the participants, though generally speaking they are. but they're coming from a real grassroots place, and they're actually calling themselves kind of adult educators. And one of my favourites is Cwmni Bro, that are working around self-organised collective action in relation to community ownership. But also they predicate their entire work, all their training, all their learning on Raymond Williams thinking, which is just brilliant. And these are young activists. So there are spaces. I know Scylla's mentioned a couple, that you've mentioned a couple, Greg, others have mentioned them. So it is to say that the appetite is still there. And I think that's really what I want to try and kind of unearth through my research, and that's why I'm very clear that it's not nostalgic. It is about, a future, particularly in light of your own political education and the rise of reform. And I'm really sorry. I know Tim's got his hand up, but I'm going to have to go in literally 5 minutes because I've got to go to Nottingham. So apologies that I'm going to have to literally bolt off. Tim.
Yeah, just to reflect on the power of adult community learning and Cwmni Bro, and I've been involved with them via my role with Adult Learning Wales. And as of last summer, Cwmni Bro Festiniog in the northwest of Wales, in an area of high unemployment, have created 200 full-time and 300 part-time jobs, as well as a lot of other volunteering opportunities.
That's a staggering achievement. Thank you, Tim. That's a really optimistic note on which to end. And I'm just going to hand over to Ian, who.
Well, no, I'm listening to, obviously, Sharon, listening to all of this and thinking about, what couple of comments. First of all, today, I think if I look literally at the comments thread as well as listening to what people are saying, this has been one of the richest set of conversations we've had. It's been absolutely fascinating. So this is just personally to thank everybody who's presented and contributed to the discussion. It's been great. The other thing is, I think from sending out those invitations, it's been probably the highest number of people who've actually turned up as well. So that's always great, isn't it? And somebody said the Zoom being part of our lifelong learning. Brenda saying that I can absolutely endorse it for our group. It's been really essential. The final thing for me is, as we think ahead to October, which we've provisionally picked as a month, there's a range of things for us to think about in terms of our own time, in terms of a range of resources. What we're going to do as a follow-up from today is share some of the materials that we ourselves have written. So as a follow-up for each of you, as well as some of the things in the thread. But I think also it will be really helpful for me, for Sharon, and for others to pick up on your ideas about the themes and purposes if we have that event. For example, I'm really struck by what Greg said, because personally, I think that idea of thinking about populism in the forms of the far right and of reform is an essential thing for us to consider, given the title of the research circle is around building community democracy and dialogue. So what I think in part we'd invite you to do is send any comments back to us. I think that will be really helpful. And then sometime in the next couple of weeks, we're going to get together. But what we will do is send out some links as a follow-up to today. Sharon, in terms of saving, having set up the Zoom link, how do you save this? Because I don't want to lose any of this chat thread.
Yeah, I actually was just in the process of trying to save it, Ian. I can normally do it easily, but there's something slightly odd going on. But I will sort it. I promise.
Thanks to everybody. It's been great to have Barry join from Narbonne.
I've enjoyed it very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Barry. It's been great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And other colleagues joining us as well. It's been really useful. We've had a number of people, which is great, today who've not been to events before, and you're very welcome, and we'll definitely be writing to you about our future plans. So if we've got chat thread saved.
I've saved it, if that helps, as one of the presenters.
Yeah, I've just thank you, Dani, and I've saved it too. So it's saved.
Brilliant. Okay.
Thank
We've
you.
all got to kind of go on and do other things today, but this has been great. Sharon, can I just pass to you for any final words before you set off to Nottingham?
No, just a huge thank you to everybody for your contributions, not just today, but to the research as well. You know, it's been an absolute privilege talking to people here, and I shall carry on and try and make something really good of it, I hope, you know, through the archive and through any materials I can create in terms of the book, articles. And I'll be coming back to you, I'm sure, at some point to talk again and to capture certain points, and we'll follow up on the chat thread as well. Just thank you from my end. Thanks to Dani and Linda.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks to all of you. Thank you. It's been great.
Yeah, cheers.
All the
Thanks,
best.
everybody.
Very much. Bye bye.
See you again. Bye.
Okay, bye.